All right, hello students. This is probably the last video I'm going to record today. I do want to do a little bit more, maybe at the beginning of the week, about Border Patrol shifts and changes after 9/11. We talked about how the war on terror extended into the war on drugs in a previous video, but what I didn't quite touch on is how the US government evolved in its policies, how the Department of Homeland Security's creation matters here. So if I have time, I will include that. If not, we can certainly just touch upon it in class if that's something you're interested in and want to write about. Okay, so actually, before we get into the content, I just want to preface this by saying that when we talk about debates surrounding immigration and the economy, it's important for us to talk about them as debates. We did a great job about this in class. I'm really aiming this more towards the audience outside of our class, outside of our school. Some people that don't take this class, that don't even know us, watch these videos. And so it's really important for us to avoid placing judgment on some of these statistics. So I'm going to present these as debates. I want to avoid endorsing any side of this argument, but just presenting the debates and starting to look at how some statistics, some numbers, some figures could act as evidence for these arguments. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Awesome. Okay, so first, let's just look at some numbers and let's talk about just how immigrants contribute to the economy, right? So first, we have about 40 million immigrants living in the United States as of 2012. So this is actually not that recent of a statistic, but that's 13% of the population. That's a really substantial amount of the population. And of course, we need to consider that that number and that proportion is higher in certain parts of the country. So here in Los Angeles, we have a greater percentage of immigrants than in a more rural part of the United States, where there may not be as many economic opportunities for people coming from outside of the country. And also, geography plays a role. If you may not want to make your way to North Dakota if you're coming from Mexico, it may make more sense for you to stop in Texas, California, etc. I think that's rather obvious. So let's talk about purchasing power. Regardless of your economic status, whether you live below the poverty line or whether you're filthy rich, you have what's called purchasing power or spending power, right? And that's pretty basic. That's the ability to buy goods, the ability to spend money. Regardless of how much money you have to spend some of it. We need to eat, for example. All of us have to buy food. We have to buy clothing. In certain parts of the country, it's almost essential to own a car, right? Of course, it's not essential, but it could be very difficult, again, in Los Angeles, to not get around without a car. So all of these things that people spend money on are actually stimulating the economy. The economy is complex. The economy is not doing well solely because of the value of the stock market, right? That's just one measure of how the economy is doing. The GDP is one measure of how the economy is doing. Purchasing power, if you are circulating lots of currency in the economy, that tends to be a very healthy thing for the economy. When people aren't spending as much money in a time of economic crisis, in a recession, in a depression, then less money is circulating. And in general, that's not good for the economy. Let's zero in on California, since I was mentioning California a lot before, that California has a huge amount of purchasing power from immigrants. In 2014, immigrants, people who were born outside of the state, and the country for that matter, spent over $240 billion. That made up about a little less than 1/3 of the entire amount of goods that were purchased in the state of California. And then these factors, or these numbers rather, also correspond to other states. And it might be interesting if you're into this, if this is a topic that interests you, to compare that, and forgive me, I don't have this data handy on this slide, but if you were to compare that to the percent of that state that is, the percent of the population, rather, of that state that is immigrants, that could be a really interesting thing to use for comparison. Another thing that's really interesting in terms of immigrant contribution to the economy is the creation of small businesses. In California alone, over 750,000 immigrants opened up businesses. That actually is over a third of all self-employed residents of the state of California. And the value of the business, all the money that was made by that business, was over $21 billion in 2015 alone. And this doesn't even account for the fact that most small businesses have some employees, right? It's rather rare for you to be just a one-person business. And so if you start a new business, you also are hiring people and you're creating jobs. Okay, let's get into, again, a little bit of proportion. We already talked about how immigrants make up about 13% of the overall population. And then let's break it down in terms of how they contribute to the workforce. Their economic output, meaning, the value of their contribution to the purchasing of goods and services, is a little bit more than the proportion that they make up of the population. They actually spend more proportionally than they make up the population. And then they also make up for more percentage-wise of the labor force. And one of the reasons why that is immigrants tend to be younger. In general, you don't move to another country to retire, you move to another country to work. And so a younger labor force accounts for that statistic. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that not a majority, but still a substantial percent of immigrants actually work in white-collar jobs, or white-collar, blue-collar is a little bit too generalized. But, you know, I would actually prefer to use the term middle class. White-collar is a little bit more of an old-school term, you know, to say that you have to wear a suit or tie to your job. But in general, these types of jobs require a college degree. They require some more advanced training. And typically they are jobs that pay a higher salary. And so that also contributes to spending power. And also, in more recent decades, we've seen an increasingly educated immigration population. So they're making up more professional fields of labor, right? Things like doctors, lawyers, college professors, etc. So with a more educated immigrant population, that is also a very interesting thing to keep in mind when you're having a debate about immigration and the economy. Okay, getting into more of the controversial elements of the debate, one of the most commonly heard arguments against immigration is that immigrants take American jobs, or regardless of where we are in the country. Similar debates are happening in the European Union, for example. Okay, we can talk about the extent to which this is true and the extent to which this is a little bit more complex. And again, I just really want us to keep an open mind when we're talking about this. So in general, lower skilled jobs, that can be true, okay? So I want to rely on this and this a little bit as we have this conversation. But I think that the logic is pretty straightforward. A lower skilled job tends to pay a lower wage. A lower skilled job tends to require little training. A lower skilled job also tends to be disposable. If you are unable or unwilling to do your job, if you get sick and are unable to report from work, it's much easier for your boss to fire you and hire someone else to replace you right away. But if you have a job that has a higher skill set, requires education, you, not always, but you may very well have much more job security. And so that's where that logic may not apply. The other reason that we need to consider this this complexity about low-skilled jobs and whether or not it's actually the immigrants that are to blame for this. This keeps minimum wage low as well, right? Many American-born citizens may feel that it is due to undocumented immigration or just an increased flow of immigration in general. They may blame that for their stagnant wages. The other thing that's worth considering, however, is that this could actually be justification for an employer to keep wages low. An employer, if they're trying to save money, they may only pay workers, or rather they may pay workers the lowest salary that they possibly can, as long as their worker is willing to accept it. So if you're desperate enough for work You may accept a job that has a very low wage. You don't like it. You want a raise, but you need the money, right? So you may take this job. It may be a garbage job, but you're still going to do it. Okay, so that has an adverse effect on anyone who is trying to get one of those jobs. So that's something worth considering, and hopefully that adds a layer of complexity to that debate. So while it is certainly true that low-wage jobs are partially continuing to be low-wage jobs, minimum wage is not adjusting along with inflation, but there's a lot of complexity there. To an extent, this is also literally a reason to not have that debate about minimum wage. Okay, what else? The other thing that's worth bearing in mind is that some of these low-paid workers actually are not U.S. citizens, that we still have guest worker programs, and those workers don't have citizen rights. They don't have things like unemployment insurance. They're not eligible to apply for things like Medicaid. So that also could keep wages low as well. Again, wages are often based on competition. You may even hear employers talk about offering a competitive salary. That may sound attractive, but to an extent, it may be competitive on the low end as well. Okay, so in general, again, sort of the conclusion here is that the lower wage jobs are impacted the most. However, another layer of complexity here. You may have noticed as I was talking that there's another group here worth considering, that college-educated workers, to an extent, also may experience some wage depression. However, college-aged foreign workers actually have more wage depression. So to translate that, there is some negative impact on even college-aged jobs in terms of wages. Part of that is due to the level of skill that is required for that job. Part of that is also surrounding the increased requirement of skills for a certain job as well. So those of us who are, none of you probably, unless you're an outsider, not in our class, is a millennial like me. All my students are Gen Zers. But millennials in general need more education to have the same job that the previous generation had. So for example, my mom was a librarian before she retired. She did not have her master's degree in the field. She just had a bachelor's, but at the time she got into that job, she didn't need one. If I were to become a librarian today, I would need my master's degree in library science. So actually, I need more education to have the same job. So to an extent, even college-educated U.S. citizens are feeling pangs on their wages due to increased competition with other college-age workers who were born outside of the United States who also have the same skill set. So I could keep going. I think this is fascinating. I hope all that made sense. This is quite complex. But if we want to write about the debate surrounding immigration and the economy, complexity is really important to consider. So yeah, when the economy is doing well, when wages can be more competitive, when there is more job creation, immigration tends to be very positive for the economy. When the economy is experiencing a pinch, that's when it gets more complex, and that's when wages certainly could be stagnated. Okay, just to wrap us up, because I realize we've been going a while, let's just talk about the federal, state, local level, how immigration actually can vary in terms of its positive or negative impact on the population. At the federal level, because of many of the things we've already discussed, job creation, purchasing power, etc., immigration has, in terms of the numbers, a positive impact on the economy. But at the state and local level, the impact can be negative. And one of the reasons why that is because of the amount of money that the government may have to spend to support that population. Again, the cost of public schooling comes to mind. However, as we said in a previous video, the Constitution, the Supreme Court, has said that it is constitutional to provide public education for all persons, even if they are not citizens in the United States. So it's constitutional, but school is expensive. Again, it's important for us to understand that when I say negative, I mean financially negative, not socially negative, not culturally negative, right? But just in terms of the cost, the financial cost, this tends to be, again, concentrated in areas where there's a much higher immigrant population. But here is what is often misunderstood, and this is why I want to make sure to cover this before we get out of here, is that many also in an anti-immigration argument argue that immigrants don't pay taxes. That is actually untrue. So regardless of whether or not someone files their taxes in April on tax day, everyone pays taxes. Tourists pay taxes even, right? If you live in a state that has sales tax, every time you purchase something, you're paying taxes, right? Yes, there are some states that don't have sales taxes, but those are rare. Most states in this country have sales tax. Here in California, we have a very high sales tax. But with that said, in general, immigrants actually do file tax returns when they're working. And if you file tax returns and if you are getting paid to begin with, you pay what are called payroll taxes. So if any of you have had an after-school job, not one where you get paid under the table in cash, but one where you get a pay stub, you can actually look at your pay stub and see how much of your paycheck goes towards Social Security and Medicare. And all of those things, everyone who's on the payroll pays, regardless of whether they are a citizen or not. So just statistically, in 2014, immigrants actually paid $123 billion worth of money into Social Security and $32 billion into Medicare. And it's important for us to realize that actually the United States operates at a deficit. So the United States has to actually borrow money to pay to fund Social Security and Medicare, particularly because the baby boomer population is retiring right now, and the current workforce does not contribute enough to Social Security and Medicare to be able to foot that bill. And so the United States keeps digging a greater hole in its deficit and debt in order to do that. And so immigrants, whether they are authorized or not, if they are paying these programs, they are helping fill that gap. So they actually pay a lot in taxes most of the time. The other reason why they actually pay a lot in taxes is because they want to establish a paper trail. They want to prove, if they apply for citizenship one day, that they've been legally, law-abiding citizens, rather, and they've been paying their taxes. It's actually a really important thing for them to do. So, I mean, ultimately, there's not a financial benefit per se, but there's a significant benefit for immigrants to legally pay their taxes. It's worth reconsidering that logic. If someone says, oh, no, they don't pay taxes that I pay, and they reap the benefits, that's actually not true. And the other thing that's not true is that most immigrants, unless they become citizens along the way, they don't get Social Security and Medicare when they reach the age that U.S. citizens are able to get them. So once you reach the age of 65, if you're not a citizen, you don't get Social Security or Medicare, but you paid for it when you were in the workforce. So they're paying for a service that they don't get back. This is just a whole bunch of facts and figures. I think this video is long enough, so if you want, you can pause and look at these statistics. Like I said, there's one last topic that we didn't get to, and that is the topic of the shifting in the U.S. federal policy towards immigration after 9/11. But it's the weekend. It's been a tough week for all of us. So I'm also going to take a break, but I will make sure to get you that information at the beginning of the week. All this week we'll be working on writing, so I hope that this content will help you get the evidence that you need to support that writing. So thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you soon.